Hi, I'm Richard and I'm part of the Common Good team. This video is going to share with you where justice fits in the grand narrative of God. If you're looking for more information, check out Bryant L. Meyer's book, Walking with the Poor, as a lot of this information is taken from chapter 2. The first thing we're going to do is climb into a helicopter and look at the big 4 chapters of God's story. In the first chapter, we see creation. We see God speaking things into being. Out of nothing, God brings everything. The next chapter, we see the fall, where human beings experience sin. We're going to come back to that later. In the third chapter, we see God entering into humanity, the defeat of sin and death through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and we call that chapter redemption. The final chapter is restoration, where Jesus returns to put everything back into its rightful place. All the things that are broken are restored. But we're not there yet, are we? What we're experiencing now, today, you and me in this city, is a combination of the effects of the fall, the hope of a restoration one day, and the current transformation that redemption brings. Let me run through another framework which can help to explain where our stories fit in with God's grander story. I'm going to draw a diagram for you. Here we have time, where God speaks things into being, the beginning of time, and there's an end of time described in Revelation. And in that space, God exists before that was created and will exist beyond the end of time. And within there, God speaks humanity into existence. And beautifully, that's the story from the first man. And one day the story of humanity will indeed come to an end. And within the story of humanity is the people's story. And that is a very loose definition of people. You could say, well, it's the people of Africa, or the people of South Africa, or even the people of this church in this country. And within that people's story exists our own individual stories. It's your story and my story, perhaps even as a small subgroup like a family. And any initiative that we run, any program that we run in the field of justice and alleviating poverty, that has its own story embedded and tied together with our own story. So every person that we interact with has their own history, has their own story that goes with them. They are not isolated people. And this framework really gives me hope and excites me because God has a purpose and a plan. My story is not independent. I have with me the story of my people that shaped who I am, the story of humanity that shapes all, and that's framed entirely within God's great story. So it's no surprise that you live where you live, that you work where you work, that your story is what it is. And it's no surprise that you live in the country that you do and have inherited its story as part of your own story. Another thing this framework really helps me with is it gives me hope, because I know how the story is going to end. The story doesn't end here and now, it ends with restoration by the hand of God. And so when I see the pain and the heartache and the suffering of people in poverty and suffering from injustice, I have hope, because one day there will be restoration. That's part of God's story, and somehow God has written me into that big story of His. And that gives me purpose. And I think I recognize is that my story with my history is interacting and intersecting with other people's histories and stories. And sometimes I interact with people and I walk away, I've grown and I've been developed. And other times God brings people across my path and they benefit from what I've given to them. Wherever it fits, I have this hope and a security in knowing that God is writing this story and somehow you are part of it and I am part of it. Earlier I mentioned the 4 chapters of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. We're going to return now to the topic of the fall. Now, it's quite hefty. I'll only be able to skim the surface. You see, Adam, through his actions, brought sin into the world, and we're affected by that today. Not only through our own sinfulness, but also because we become victims of other people's sinfulness too. And the question we want to ask ourselves in the context of this conversation about poverty and injustice, how does the fall or how does sin affect us today? To tell or to walk you through this, I want to draw a diagram. See, God has placed us in the context of a range of relationships. We have a relationship with ourselves, we have a relationship with God, with others, with the community, and with the environment. And what sin does is it brings a disturbance, a disruption, perhaps even distraction of the relationships in this diagram. What you'll see is that sin not only impacts our relationship with God, which naturally it does, it also impacts our relationship with ourselves. We begin to believe things about ourselves that simply just aren't true. Another thing we notice is a break of relationship with others, where people try to oppress each other on the basis of race or socioeconomic status. We also see sin breaking relationship with the environment, where people are no longer good stewards of what God has entrusted to us. And we see a break of relationship with community. We see people living separate lives, being quite content, being completely divided from each other. And this diagram, if you picture all of us, exists within a much larger system of economics and financial systems, religious structures, and so on. So when we think about the cause of poverty, we must think about these relationships also in the context of other causes of poverty. We think about calamity, we think about oppression, and we think about personal sin. Those things contribute towards people being pushed into poverty. We think about calamity, things like disasters, floods, fires, a medical illness. Those things can push people into poverty. Oppression is when someone is pushed into poverty through the sinfulness of somebody else. And lastly, personal sin is often the thing we think of first when someone is in poverty. But really it is just one factor. People making poor decisions, selfish decisions, ungodly decisions that contribute towards their own poverty. Now, all of those things play together, but the encouraging thing is that because sin is at the cause and at the heart of all of this, the gospel message that we learn in redemption, the gospel message has the power to overcome all of these broken relationships. What we see and what we learn is that we have hope for the future, because the very means of overcoming these challenges and this oppression and sin, the very means has been given to us in the gospel. God has not left us alone. He's given us the hope and the means of facing these massive challenges. He's also given us His church. He's placed us in a community of people, the very body, His bride that takes His message to the world. He places us there. And another thing He does, He gives us His scripture, His revelation of who He is, who we are, and how we are to relate to each other. And the next thing He gives us is His Spirit, the motivating force behind mission, the one who stirs us into action, the one who convicts us of our sin. His Spirit, He gifts us with those very things to accomplish His mission on this planet as part of His story. So in landing, I want to leave two encouragements with you. Firstly, is to live humbly. When we recognize that sin has affected every single one of us and damaged all of our relationships, we recognize that we need God's help. We are not whole people trying to serve broken people. No. We are broken people who, by the grace of God, are being healed. And similarly, the person that we're interacting with is also a broken person by the grace of God being healed. So let's walk humbly. The next encouragement is to live with hope. You know, when we live with gospel dependence, we can lift our eyes above the current pain and heartache in our city. We can look beyond the political landscape and all the things that are going on. We can lift our eyes above it. Why? Because we know this is not how the story ends. God is still writing His story. The pen is in His hands, not in the hands of our current leaders. In fact, those leaders' stories will one day come to an end. The pen is firmly in His hand and He is still writing it. He is still writing your story. He's still writing my story, the story of the city and the story of this country. And that leaves me with hope.